Good afternoon, everyone, and you're all very welcome to our 40th anniversary of the Code celebration event. We are absolutely delighted to have such an incredible panel with us this afternoon. I can't tell you how excited we've all been to have so many wonderful speakers joining us today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jennifer Hanratty. I am one of the founders of Breastmilk, and today's event is going to be brought to you in two parts. So first up, we will have a conversation with Nigel Rollins and Claire Patton, and then I'll hand over to Catherine to introduce our second section with a fabulous panel of international leaders on the international code on the marketing of breast milk substitutes. For those of you who don't know what the code is yet, you will be intimately acquainted with it by the time we get to the end of this session today. But it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our first two speakers, Dr. Nigel Rollins, who is originally from Northern Ireland, trained as a paediatrician at Queen's University in Belfast. He completed his doctoral research in Tanzania before going to South Africa, where he lived and worked for 14 years and was a professor and head of the Centre for Maternal and Child Health at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, in Durban, where his work focused on diarrheal disease, malnutrition and HIV. Nigel then joined the WHO's Department of Maternal, Newborn and Child and Adolescent Health in 2008, and where he is a member of the Research and Guidelines Development Team, which is a very important and influential role. Dr. Rollins has led several multi-centre trials studying antiretroviral drugs and postnatal transmission of HIV and implemented programs that prevent mother-to-child HIV transmission through infant feeding. Dr. Rollins was one of the authors of the landmark Lancet series on breastfeeding, which demonstrated the huge impacts on global health and economics of protecting breastfeeding. Joining Dr. Nigel Rollins, we have the fabulous Dr. Claire Patton. Claire studied law at undergraduate level and progressed to a master's degree and PhD in corporate law, also at Queen's University in Belfast. She is now a lecturer in corporate law at the School of Law in Queen's, and Claire's area of research focuses on the commercial determinants of female and child health. She has a special interest in how the marketing practices of large corporations affect the health of women and children. Claire has been working for some time on a body of work that puts forward the argument that breastfeeding ought to be formally recognised by the UN as a human right, and her work will be published later this year. Claire also works with an international consortium of researchers led by the World Health Organization, which seeks to better understand how breastfeeding can be protected for all mother-child dyads via a multi-strategy approach at both international and domestic levels. I am absolutely delighted to welcome both of you this afternoon. I'm going to hand over to Nigel.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's absolutely fantastic to join Breastmilk this year. So I'm very, very grateful for the invitation and to be sharing a bit of time with Claire. It's great to see people that are coming on after, and they will no doubt correct the things that I make mistakes on, and they will fill the gaps. So I've probably got the easiest role of all for this afternoon. So, but it's very, very much appreciated. So without any further ado, I'm just going to jump in and see if I can just get this presentation up. Sorry. Always takes a moment. There we go. Hopefully this should be it. Could you just confirm that's up okay there?
Yeah, that's great.
Jennifer, great. So as Jennifer said, we're really thinking about breastfeeding and the international code. But as you'll see from some of my slides a little bit later on, I think it actually goes substantially beyond the code as well, some of the issues that we really want to be thinking about. So I don't normally do this actually, of putting up a slide to say what I want to try to cover. But I am going to do that just today. And I do want to start off with an initial starting point of really why breastfeeding matters to everybody. In WHO is often sort of associated with the health and well-being of mothers, children, families in lower or middle income settings. But this is not a low and middle income matter at all. I wanted then to talk a little just a bit about the actual marketing of breast milk substitutes and the code. And then just finish off with really one or two slides only about what needs to happen. And I may slip sometimes from referring to BMS and instead talk about CMF. And a number of us have been talking about referring to commercial milk formula as opposed to breast milk substitutes, because breast milk substitutes in some settings confers the sense that it is an equivalent, and that is certainly used within the whole marketing world. And some colleagues have been using the term commercial milk formula as a preference. So as a warning, in the future, I may just slip into that language. If I use CMF or if my slides say that, you'll understand what it refers to. So why breastfeeding matters, and this is part of the analyses led by Cesar Victoria and published in The Lancet in 2016. And it would, if breastfeeding practices were improved to what WHO actually recommends, then annually about 820,000 children under the age of 5 years would not die. That the majority of those deaths are in very young infants, less than 6 months, and the vast majority of it would be infection related. Breastfeeding prevents diarrhea, prevents pneumonia, and other than very specific conditions like necrotizing enterocolitis, which is a high priority in high income settings where premature infants often suffer from that. But it also is very important in terms of preventing minor infections such as otitis media. And that evidence at the base is pretty clear. It goes on, the series and in the analyses, to look at the impact of breastfeeding in other aspects of life. It is associated with a significant and measurable difference in IQ. And even when you control for the quality of studies and you control for maternal IQ, it's associated with improved IQ and increased adult earnings. And that globally translates into a very large economic value of several billion in terms of gross national value. It is the single most effective intervention for preventing childhood obesity in terms of prevention. And even whenever you restrict that to high quality studies, it has a 13% prevention effect. And for mothers, it prevents currently about 20,000 deaths per year from invasive breast cancer, and it would save an additional 20,000 from breast cancer and also reduce the risk of ovarian cancer. So this is not an issue that is restricted to low-income settings. It is certainly a matter for all settings. But there are paradoxes when we look at the data, and these data have been reanalyzed and looked at. But even in 2016, we could see that despite everything that we know about breastfeeding, its exceptional contribution to survival, growth, and lifelong health and development, that breastfeeding rates have only increased marginally over the past 20 years. And it's a strange, but it's a true phenomenon. One of the other strange things is that breastfeeding is one of the few positive health benefits that are more prevalent in low, middle, and income countries than in high income countries. Normally, as we've seen with COVID and vaccine status, that it tends to be the high income countries that adopt and support the best of the health interventions. But that's not actually what we see globally. And in fact, in low and middle income countries, about 40% of infants are exclusively breastfed. 2/3 of children continue to be breastfed between 6 and 12 months, whereas less than 20% of high income country children are actually breastfed through to 12 months. And one of the real challenges is that the data is actually very limited. And we see that it tends to be the more educated and wealthier women who breastfeed for longer. And one of the real difficulties in balancing and sort of the juxtapositioning of these data is that we see that whenever countries increase in their GDP per capita, that breastfeeding prevalence at 12 months tends to decrease by 10 percentage points. So we see many more countries moving into the middle income brackets, and that population is therefore increasing substantially. And therefore, we are seeing a balancing out of breastfeeding as individual families gain more wealth. And that's clearly probably related to work practices, amongst other things. So there are many paradoxes. When we juxtapose that and position that against what we see about sales of formula milk, this was an analysis presented in the 2016 papers, and actually there's been an adjustment of this by the company called Euromonitor, who have these data and produce these data for industry. In 2014, the global sales of all milk formulas was around about $44 billion. And at that time, they projected the value of the market to reach about 70 billion by last year, or 2019. The actual turnover was more in the order of 58 billion, and that was just an adjustment. But even if it was 70 billion or 58 billion or 60 billion, it's still an extraordinary amount of money that the milk formula market has, certainly even through the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, it continued to grow at 6, 7, 8% year on year. Now, if you were to take the exclusive breastfeeding rate of 40% and you were to increase that by 6 or 8% year on year, you would achieve the global nutrition target of 50% exclusive breastfeeding in about 4 or 5 years. So what industry manages to achieve on an annual basis has simply not been matched by what we have been able to do with support and practices around breastfeeding. So I think we need to be honest and sort of say there are indeed many reasons why women don't breastfeed. Many women choose not to breastfeed. And you can ask, why is that? You know, what are the values and beliefs about breastfeeding that influence that decision? There are, for some women, physical limitations. There is the whole thing that people will be aware of perceived milk insufficiency and confidence. There are issues around work conditions. All of these things are true, and there are more. But as much as we acknowledge these things, we need to accurately understand the far-reaching consequences of marketing. And one of the things I really want to differentiate and distinguish, and I think as a community we have not done well, is that all too often in the past, there has been a polarization between mothers and families, between those that breastfeed and those that choose to give formula. And that's not where the argument lies. From my own view and from WHO's perspective, this is not about removing formula milk from shelves. It is not removing it from supermarkets. It is not about denying choice. This is actually all about the marketing practices, which fundamentally aim to reshape not just individual views, but societal values, beliefs, and norms that interact with health professionals to modify their views and beliefs, and that they aim to reshape the political landscape so that all of the decision-making in every setting actually favors the sales of commercial milk formula. And so the focus of what I'm going to share now is really about the marketing practices, and we should not conflate that with the product, the commodity of formula milk. It's certainly true that industry diversifies its market. It produces many different types of formula as a standard approach for increasing sales. And so there is, there are questions certainly about the commodity as to which are really needed, which have value, et cetera, But what I'm going to refer to now is the marketing practice and the influence of marketing practice on individual decision-making. So some people will maybe recall that a lot of the attention really came from this particular report, where War on Want did an investigation into the promotion and safe use of powdered milks in the third world, what was called the third world. And this was a revolutionary report. It highlighted the unethical practices of several large global companies that manufacture and distribute formula milk. As a result of it, there was an international boycott of some of the global leading manufacturers. At the same time, there was a WHO study which also found and described these outcomes, And as a result of this, there was a series of US congressional hearings, which actually were prompted by Ted Kennedy. And as a consequence of those congressional hearings, there was money released and there was a calling together of all the member states of the world through a series of meetings convened by WHO that resulted in agreement on what is called the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. And this code of marketing was adopted by the World Health Assembly in 1981. So effectively, this is the one body that represents the collective will of the world's member states. And it was ratified by all countries immediately except the US and South Africa, and they have since ratified it and adopted it. But the level of and the quality of the legislation varies enormously within countries. And it's only in the order of 20 or 30 countries that have actually legislated significant policies that are largely aligned with the code. So although they adopted the code in the World Health Assembly, there's a massive gap between what is stated in the code and the legislation in countries. So this is the foundational document. And subsequent to the actual agreement of the code, there have been subsequent resolutions. And certainly from a WHO and member state and UN perspective, when we refer to the code, we refer to all of the provisions of the original code 40 years ago, and we also include all the subsequent resolutions and the modifications and clarifications that are embedded within the resolutions. So henceforth, and I'm sure when some colleagues will speak later on, they will refer to the code, but they will be referring, in fact, to the full range, including these modifications about clarification on donation of supplies, what should happen in emergencies, conflicts of interest, the duration of exclusive breastfeeding, health claims, and then really some things around healthcare provisions and cross promotions. But it should be said that even with all of these, there are gaps and deficiencies in the code, which are only becoming aware of, and some major ones as we go forward. So just to give you a very, very rough sense of what these articles and the provisions include, Article 1 defines and shares about the aim of protecting and promoting breastfeeding and also the proper use of breast milk substitutes when needed, but that this should be based on adequate information and with the appropriate marketing and distribution. I should say that in the original definition of, in the code, marketing includes the distribution and dissemination, the actual practice of distribution. I think many of us, whenever we are thinking about marketing, restrict that to the advertising and the actual ways by which a product is presented, shaped, informed, and so on. But the technical term, as in the code, actually included the physical dissemination and distribution of the product. So, but the code in itself was not in principle against breast milk substitutes. Article 2 referred to the scope about breast milk substitutes. And as mentioned, it refers to the duration of breastfeeding, which is up to 24 months or longer. And therefore, from a WHO perspective and the code's perspective, breast milk substitutes includes all products that are intended for the children up until the age of 36 months. And it also includes things on feeding bottles and teats. It covers areas around informational and educational materials, talks about the government responsibility, what should and what should not be on the packaging. It talks about the promotion to public, about advertising or other promotions, no samples, gifts, things like that through hospitals. It talks about what should be within the retail environment, the no promotional devices, and this is highly sophisticated, what's on the top shelves, what's on the bottom shelves, cross promotion, all of those details are captured within the code. It talks a lot about health facilities and professionals, about what is allowed and what's not allowed. And this is very contentious because industry still argues the need to provide healthcare providers with accurate information. What is in dispute, however, is whether that information is impartial and accurate, or to what extent it is shaped by evidence that industry itself has produced through industry-sponsored research. It talks about the labels, what's allowed and what's not allowed. The main issue is that really, despite all of these provisions within the code, we see that despite the Nestle boycott in the 70s, despite the provisions of the code, despite agreement by the member states and what is the collective will of the member states, we see that violations of the code simply continue. And that unethical marketing, the part of marketing definition that includes the advertisement, the reaching out to families, the reaching out to health professionals, the influencing and the shape of normative values and beliefs, that has in fact never stopped. And there are reports after reports after reports, and in the public health literature that say that this is continuing. Even just recently, there was a report from Brazil describing the widespread violations within shops and in health facilities, with the same major producers being the main violators as well, despite all the rhetoric that comes from them. And even during the period of COVID, there have been publications that have documented how even in the United Kingdom, but in Pakistan, Indonesia, Philippines, how even the fears and the susceptibility and the vulnerability of families who have been worried about infant feeding and breastfeeding and COVID, this has even been seen as a marketing opportunity. And although we've seen that in the context of emergencies, it is really, I think, very sobering to see it today. So WHO has recently completed a study of 8 countries. It shows the same types of marketing themes. It has gathered the information. It is showing the ubiquity, the way in which industry still exploits trust and interpersonal connections to gain validity and trust and confidence. And all of this is used to influence aspiration and to drive emotional appeals towards increasing sales. It uses the sources through advertisement, marketing online, social media. It targets health professionals in a very, very distinctive and definite way, and still continues to use promotional activities. So these are all violations of the code. But to me, what is probably more revealing is that all of the research that WHO has been involved with working on shows how these are not sporadic ad hoc violations, but they reveal how marketing is an entire system. It is a system of influence. It is highly powerful. It is resourced. It is coordinated. It is sophisticated at every level. It is not just women or families that are being influenced. It is health professionals, society at large, and the politics. And when we think about that, we then got to say, what would be our response? I'm going to jump that. One of the main things that it does is that it damages objective information, autonomy, and decision-making. And this is true for all families and mothers, regardless of whether they are wanting to breastfeed or to formula feed. It distorts the environment where decision-making occurs. And so it is not just a matter of the consequence for the individual child, but it has societal costs as well. So I'm just going to finish. I think I've got 2 slides. What needs to happen and what could happen? Well, the first and most obvious is that national authorities, who are the official duty bearers, need to execute their roles. They need to establish the policies and commit finances to appropriately support breastfeeding. They need to appropriately monitor and enforce the code. And this requires an all-of-government engagement and action. It is not just health. It is trade, it is justice, it is labor, it is finance. It's needed across the board. Health professionals need to take their responsibility, both individually and collectively, to protect, promote, and support breastfeeding. And that means recognizing and avoiding marketing processes that inherently create conflicts of interest. They need to advocate and provide themselves appropriate support for breastfeeding and also support for those mothers who choose not to breastfeed. But there's a whole range of things that go beyond government and health professionals. There are many bodies that have the scope and influence to mitigate the impact of marketing. Global agencies, the UN, the ILO, the Office for the High Commission of Human Rights, the Human Rights Council, all need to recognize the exceptional importance of early infant feeding on lifelong health and how marketing distorts decision-making. And they all have the opportunity to redress these influences through their respective mechanisms. Investors can insist on ethical practices that protect children in the future. Marketing companies can decline to do business with those that are marketing around early infant feeding. Consumer groups, people for whom infant feeding is not their main bread and butter, they can lend support to protect the futures of children. All of this is really contingent on agreement of what sort of world do we want. Is it a world that is essentially profit-driven, or is it a world that really seeks to protect the futures of children? It is absolutely right to protect the rights of women to choose what is best for them and their children. Part of that is establishing an environment that is the responsibility of government and all of society that is fully supportive of breastfeeding. But this is an issue that to leave you with, or a thought. We know how important breastfeeding is in all settings, high, middle, and low income settings. And we know quite clearly how marketing as a system disrupts informed decision-making at individual and collective level, and that has negative consequences for both health and human rights. And so one thought to leave with you is that the marketing of BMS should simply be off limits. As society has decided on smoking in public, about the timeline and the time limit for fossil fuels, marketing of BMS should simply be off limits. So I'll be delighted to hear from you on some of those thoughts, and look forward to what Claire will be saying to add on to this. Thanks indeed.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Nigel. We're just going to open up to a few questions, and I have a question already come in from Genevieve. Genevieve, if you would like to unmute, you can ask your question directly.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Nigel.
Hello.
Yes, in Ireland, like many other countries, the code is put into breastfeeding strategies. And should this be put into broader general health behaviors and consumer protection so that it's clearer this is protection for all from inappropriate marketing, rather than just protection about breastfeeding, you know, to place it with healthy eating, obesity, alcohol, smoking, exercise, mental wellness, who are all influenced by marketing? Or is it better to keep it separate as a breastfeeding issue? Thanks.
Thanks, Genevieve. I think it really says, you know, I think everybody is recognizing the terms of commercial determinants of child health. But I think we've got to recognize that there are clearly the unhealthy and the negative commercial determinants or commercial determinants that have negative consequences. But there are commercial determinants that have the potential for beneficial health outcomes, and we shouldn't just jump to say it's all negative. My own thinking at the moment, and I think this is going to be an area for discussion over the next coming years, is the case in point of breastfeeding as an exemplar to balance issues about human rights, about health outcomes, about profit. I think we have seen the tension between livelihood and health being really at the forefront of the COVID pandemic. And my sense is that it's probably better to play this out in an area where we really have high quality evidence about the health outcomes and the importance of breastfeeding, for example, on health, and where we have very clear insight on the suboptimal health outcomes associated with non-breastfeeding. We need to see how this plays out in terms of language. As I say, I think that we have been clumsy and clunky when it comes to the way that we've talked about formula milk. It has tended to result in polarization between breastfeeding and non-breastfeeding communities. This is about marketing. And I think we've really got to differentiate marketing from the commodity. I think our language has got to be much more careful and sensitive to our neighbor, and to really say that this is an issue about industry and its marketing practices. And I think it's probably easier at this stage to focus on this one area and then to allow it to have consequences and to see how it can propagate for good in other areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Nigel. And we're going to move on now to welcome Claire Patton. Claire, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you, Nigel. That was so interesting. Catherine, have you got my slides? Brilliant. Thanks a million. So that should save us a bit of time with me fiddling about and trying to get them working and whatnot. So yeah, my name is Claire Patton. I'm a lecturer in the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast, and the question that I'm going to pose today and try to answer is that on the 40th anniversary of the WHO Code, is it time to formally recognise breastfeeding as a human right? And then within that, and to a smaller degree, I'm also going to talk about more recent research that I've been doing sort of over the summer, which is how is the BMS industry using the code to legitimise BMS marketing? Next slide, please, Catherine. So, yeah, we can, right. So I was just going to talk a little bit here, but I think that I'm really preaching to the choir. So we can, all I say very briefly is that studies, empirical studies show that human milk and breastfeeding is optimal for both mother and baby. And existing studies also show that the BMS companies or BMS industry engage in aggressive and harmful and inappropriate marketing strategies. So next slide, please. And I just want to sort of, what Nigel was talking about there about what is covered by the code, just to say that what I'm talking about specifically are the milks. So not so much the bottles and the teats, more thinking about the milks. So that is that the WHO, because I'm thinking, or I'm going to be talking about the BMS companies, the milk manufacturers. So the WHO code, or the WHO rather, define BMS as any milk in either liquid or powdered form that are specifically marketed for feeding infants and young children up to the age of 3. So thank you. Next slide. So as we say, there is no doubt whatsoever about the benefits to maternal and child health and well-being of breastfeeding and human milk. That being said, there is a legitimate need and a place in society for breast milk substitutes, and that can never be denied. The issue for infant and young child feeding advocates concerns the strategies often used by the BMS industry. So studies show that there is a measurable effect on breastfeeding of aggressive and inappropriate breast milk substitute marketing campaigns. So for me, the research gap exists in establishing how do we move beyond these repeated calls for states to effectively regulate breast milk substitute marketing and for the breast milk substitute industry to cease inappropriate marketing. So that's really what I'm interested in. Obviously, the broader picture has to look at things like maternity leave and access to lactation consultants, you know, for the bigger scope for breastfeeding figures and support for breastfeeding. But I'm specifically thinking about just the marketing of breast milk substitutes. Now, I say that the UN system has been underutilized in identifying the possibilities for an international human rights framework for infant and young child feeding with a special focus on the protection of human milk as the normative first food for babies. Thanks. Next slide. So the fundamental human rights treaties, so these are the treaties that were drawn up, you know, decades back and came in and around the 1960s, don't explicitly recognize some of our more contemporary human rights issues. So for example, the human right to a healthy environment is not explicitly recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or in any other UN human rights instruments. But there are growing calls for it to be formally recognised by the UN General Assembly. And the former rapporteur on human rights and the environment, whenever he was advocating for this, said that the recognition for the right to a healthy environment could take various forms, because the path to recognising a new human right can come about in various different ways. So he was talking about the right to a healthy environment and said that the simplest may be the adoption of a resolution, and so the right to a healthy environment could follow the same path taken by the rights to water and sanitation, which is now a right. Now, the right to water and sanitation was also similarly omitted from the foundational human rights agreements, but they were understood to be inherent in them, in the same way that it's understood that breastfeeding is understood to be inherent in rights under right to food and right to health, etc. So the pathway for gaining formal recognition of the right to water and sanitation is currently being used to advocate for a right to a healthy environment. And when looking at the scientific evidence of the importance of breast milk to maternal and child morbidity and mortality, I argue that a case can be made that breastfeeding should also be considered as a human right. And this is made all the stronger by the fact that the right to education and basic knowledge of the advantages of breastfeeding is recognised in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is, of course, a core human rights treaty. Therefore, the importance of breastfeeding is already recognised in international law. So the next logical step is enhancing its protection through formal recognition by the UN. Next slide, please. So this is, I'm not going to go into details about this now, but this is in the article that I have written. So this is showing that in international law and under all of the criteria, I have spent the last couple of years going through all of this and checking that breastfeeding meets the criteria to be recognised as a new human right, as a standalone human right, and to be formally recognised. And so what I'm talking about today isn't so much which path it can take, because it could take several different paths. It's really just to highlight that under international law, breastfeeding can be recognised, can be formally recognised as a human right. Thank you. Next slide. So who is the rights holder? And this is what can cause some controversy whenever we're talking about human rights and a right to breastfeed, because the understanding can be sometimes that the mother is the duty bearer and the child is the rights holder, but that wouldn't be the case. Now, back in 2006, George Kent wrote a really influential paper about breastfeeding and human rights. And he wrote that infants have the right to be breastfed in the sense that no one may interfere with the woman's right to breastfeed. This means that the pair taken together have certain rights in relation to outside parties, such as rights to certain kinds of information and services, and the right to be protected from undue influences. So I use Kent's work to support mine, but then I take mine one step further, and I say, and I advocate that because the mother and child rely on each other to breastfeed, and it is a determinant of health for both, it is logical to recognize breastfeeding as a dyadic right. So it's not a right, so where Kent writes that it's a women's right to breastfeed, or infants have the right to breastfeed, I say that that right attaches to the dyad. And so the dyad is the rights holder, and then the state is the duty bearer. And there is precedent in international law for recognizing a mother and an infant as one unit. Often it's maybe not the nicest comparison to make, but it's often to do with corporal punishment and death penalties and things like that, that they recognize that a mother, infant, dyad are one unit, and so they don't separate them. And then there are other examples within soft law as well, where it is recognized that a mother and child are a dyad. So next slide, please. So bodily autonomy, kind of following on from that, we're often talking about bodily autonomy is used in debates about breastfeeding and infant feeding. Bodily autonomy is often brought up in a way that the mother has the right to choose whether or not she wants to breastfeed or feed formula, or whichever mix of these that she wants to do. But I think that we should flip that around and think of the bodily autonomy actually in being that while a mother is not obligated to breastfeed, that for as long as the breast milk substitute industry or corporations are allowed to market their products in the harmful and inappropriate ways that we know that they are. We say that mothers actually don't have bodily autonomy right now because they don't have access to completely unbiased and only scientific factual information around infant and young child feeding. And they won't have full bodily autonomy until such time as that marketing has been restricted. No, that's fine, thanks. Next slide. So imagining a human right to breastfeed. So states parties would have an obligation to ensure the passage of legislation that would embed the WHO Code and subsequent resolutions into domestic law. So things like, so what could a right to breastfeed look like whenever we're actually putting this in, we're passing legislation? I would say that we would be prohibiting the promotion of all breast milk substitutes, including those products aimed at children aged over 6 months and up to 36 months. I'm sure that most of you know that now, but just for any of those of you who don't know that is one of the biggest loopholes that we face in the marketing of infant formula, that corporations will adhere to the code up until the formula is for 6 months. And a lot of domestic legislation also restricts and prohibits marketing up to 6 months, sometimes 12 months. So what we would say is that we should be restricting the marketing of all breast milk substitutes right up to the age 24, 36 months. Consumers, particularly pregnant persons, expectant and new parents, as well as healthcare workers, should have access to objective and consistent information that is unbiased, scientific and factual. Breast milk substitutes should be sold in standardized plain packaging, and all claims should be made in the context of the biologically normal infant and young child feeding method. And the labeling should carry a warning of the empirically proven risks of not breastfeeding. And I'm more than happy to talk about that last point because I know it can be a bit controversial, but I do expand on it in my work. Next slide, please. Now, this is not looking forward, but it's looking right now into the present and back into the past. This is what the code already places, the responsibilities that are already placed on the BMS industry. So just among others. So they are to ensure that marketing practices, packaging and labeling practices comply with code provisions. And they must comply with the code provisions regardless of the national laws in place. I don't really have time to go into it in a lot of detail now, but having undertaken a scoping project looking at the different companies' approaches to their marketing policies, there's a lot of blame shifting or responsibility shifting rather to, it's not us, we don't make the rules, it's up to each individual state. Okay, next slide, please. So this is moving on to the work that I've been doing over the summer, and that's a scoping project looking at the human rights, business and human rights responsibilities and corporate social responsibilities, the policies around those of the big 5 formula companies. And then I'm comparing that to each of the responsible BMS marketing policies that each corporation has. 2 of the issues that I found among many is that the BMS industry interpret rather than directly embed the code into their responsible BMS marketing policies, and that the BMS industry often use corporate social responsibility tools to conflate adherence to corporate social responsibility with adherence to the code. And by CSR, corporate social responsibility tools, I'm talking about things like the FTSE for Good Index, which is a listing that corporations who are seen to be ethically responsible, they're listed on this FTSE for Good Index. And that kind of goes back to what Nigel was talking about before about ethical investors. There's a huge push within corporate governance for shareholders to take a more active role in how corporations are behaving, their corporate social responsibility. So there's a huge push for by shareholders for corporations to act more responsibly. And so by being placed on the FTSE for Good Index, that's one way that they can appease the shareholders. The problem is that these corporations are conflating their adherence to something like the FTSE for Good Index, which has a much lower standard than the WHO code. And within their policies, they're going quite seamlessly from one to the other. So from the code to the FTSE for Good Index back to the code. And so for a reader who's just reading it, it looks like they're adhering to the code when in fact they're not, they're adhering to the FTSE for Good Index. So I think this is my second to last slide now that I'll move on to. And it's really just a very, very quick overview of some of the findings relating to that, quite simple findings relating to that. So down the left-hand side are what we call the big five formula. So these are the big guys whenever it comes to infant formula manufacturing and production, etc. And if you look then, so the scope of BMS products covered by voluntary BMS marketing policy. So this column here is essentially where the company themselves are saying, right, we will restrict the marketing of these products. So each of these, you can see Nestle, Danone, Orbi, and Abbott restricted from just 6 months down. So remember that the code is actually saying that it goes up much further than that, whereas they're saying that it's just up to 6 months. And then Friesland Campina have it at 12 months. The other consequence of adhering to something like the FTSE for Good Index rather than the WHO code is that the FTSE for Good Index split the countries into high risk and low risk. So they're talking about in high risk countries, they're saying that no, the adherence should be stricter. There should be stricter restrictions on the marketing of breast milk substitutes. And so you can see 3 of the companies that we have here, Nestle, Danone, and Orbi are listed on the FTSE for Good. And as a consequence, they have extended the scope to high-risk countries up to 12 months as per the FTSE for Good. Now, Abbott have also extended up to 12 months, and in their responsible marketing policy, they reference higher risk and low risk countries, but they're not listed on the FTSE for Good Index. But I would imagine that they are looking to get listed on the FTSE for Good Index at some point, which is why they're adhering to it now. Ironically, Friesland Campina, who are not listed on the FTSE for Good Index, are the only one who have the scope covered at 12 months. But it's just a little insight into how, so the WHO code most certainly doesn't split high risk and low risk, as Nigel's presentation, or as Nigel told us at the very beginning, that breastfeeding in human milk is of benefit to every mother and to every child, no matter the social settings or the economic backgrounds. Thanks, Catherine. I was moving on to that final slide. So going forward, if breastfeeding is recognised as a human right, then the moral weight and legal force of human rights law can be utilised to become a defender of the mother-child dyad. And indeed, the dyad has much greater power to become an agent and advocate for their right to informed choice in infant and young child feeding matters. And it just puts a greater pressure on states to embed the code into domestic legislation, and then everything else that kind of follows on from that, that we don't have time to talk about today, but like the better support for breastfeeding and maternity pay and all of the hundreds of other things that we could talk about. But that is me. I hope I've stayed within my time. Thank you very, very much. That's my email. Drop me a line if you want to continue the conversation, and I'm also there on Twitter as well. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk, and I look forward to the Q&A at the end.
Thanks so much, Claire. So we're going to move on to the next portion of the panel, but I just wanted to highlight a comment from Esther Peacock saying that she loves the idea of treating the mother and baby as a dyad. Their right is to breastfeed, and it is the state's duty to uphold that right. It's an excellent concept. And I am going to hand over to Catherine to introduce our next panel.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you to our speakers in the first session. It's my absolute honour to introduce the next section of this session. The 4 speakers that we have are absolutely incredible. We have David Clark, Dr. Vicky Simpson, Claire Alcott, and Dr. Maria Heron. David Clark is an international public health and human rights lawyer who spent 25 years as a legal specialist with the nutrition section of UNICEF. Since 1995, David has assisted more than 60 countries in implementing the International Code of Marketing of Breastmilk Substitutes, and has been instrumental in bringing a human rights-based approach to the protection, promotion, and support of breast milk or breastfeeding. Dr. Vicky Simpson is the Director of First Steps Nutrition and Secretariat of the Breastfeeding Law Group UK. The BFLG UK was formed by the UK NGO Baby Milk Action in 1997 and has grown to 31 members to date. Together, they are calling for the UK laws governing the marketing of infant formula, follow-on formula, and other breast milk substitutes to better reflect the international code, in order to protect breastfeeding and ensure parents and carers can make informed decisions about how they feed their children without undue commercial influence. Claire Alcott was trained as a nurse, midwife and health visitor in England, and moving to Ireland 30 years ago, where she worked as a public health nurse in the Community Mothers Programme. Now retired, Claire was a volunteer for NCT breastfeeding counsellors from 1987 and an IBCLC from 1999. At the turn of the millennium, Claire compiled the KidU Infant Feeding Survey 2000, which reported on breastfeeding initiation rates of under 30% in some hospitals and inaccurate data in others. While encouraging to see rising breastfeeding rates, works continues to protect breastfeeding in Ireland. Claire is a founder member of Baby Feeding Law Group Ireland and EPFAN Group in the Republic of Ireland, an alliance of organisations and individuals working together to improve legislation around infant feeding. And finally, Dr. Maria Heron. Maria is an advocate of breastfeeding with a particular interest in how women support each other to breastfeed. She undertook a PhD at Ulster University entitled A Conceptual Analysis and Interpretation of Women's Experience of Online Breastfeeding Support. Her research interests include women-centered maternity services and breast milk as an environmentally friendly and zero-waste food. Maria is an independent researcher and administrator on Code Monitoring NI and has recently set up a social good company called I Breastfeed. And I'd like to welcome David to speak now, and thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you so much for inviting me. I mean, this is a nice way as we get towards the end of World Breastfeeding Week to have a celebration of what we've achieved while reflecting on I mean, a great deal that still needs to be done. So it's really a pleasure to be with you today. And I'm just going to speak briefly. I don't have any slides, just a few reflections on this, the 40th anniversary of the code. And it's an instrument I've been working with for over a quarter of a century, about 25 years. And I've heard, you know, over the years, certainly in more recent years, particularly from the formula industry folks, you know, this code is so obsolete, it doesn't work. Why are we still talking about something that was adopted in 1981? For goodness sake, the world has changed. But I just wanted to try and put across the message that the code is as relevant today as it was 40 years ago, and if not more relevant, I would say. And I think that Nigel, in his terrific presentation, I think showed some of the evidence as to why it is more important today than ever. When the code was adopted in 1981, we didn't have all this evidence that Nigel presented, for example, from the Lancet breastfeeding series, which shows exactly how vital breastfeeding is to infant and young child health, survival, development, and indeed to a mother's health. So, you know, we know a lot more. We also have, and I really enjoyed Claire's presentation there, a much greater understanding of the basic human rights aspects of breastfeeding for both the mother and the child, this dyad that we're talking about. And it's, Claire, I was really happy to see how you are advancing this, let's say, the exactly how we are able to describe and articulate the human rights elements that George Kent presented several years ago. And I think this is a very exciting and very important aspect. So we have, you know, the scientific knowledge that has increased and grown greatly. We have this increased understanding of the human rights aspects, which I think, Claire, as you go ahead with your work, I absolutely do believe it will give us that additional authority and means and tools to be able to bring more pressure to bear on governments to fulfill their international legal obligations to protect mothers and babies. from this unethical marketing by the formula companies. So I think we have to bear these things in mind and realize that we're talking about a current issue, an instrument that's very important to the lives we lead today. And also recognize, Nigel also in his presentation pointed out that these resolutions, subsequent resolutions adopted by the World Health Assembly have been adopted fairly regularly over the years in order to keep the code up to date. So we're not talking about a 1981 instrument. We're talking about an instrument that has been updated regularly as the companies have tried everything in their power to try and get around the code, to try and argue and confuse governments into believing, for example, that the code only covers breast milk substitutes up to the age of 6 months, when we know that's absolutely not true. And we have the subsequent resolutions and various guidance documents, etc., that clarify that that is not the case. The companies tried inventing new products over the years. 1981, there was only infant formula on the market, for example. And that was a suitable breast milk substitute to be used throughout the baby's the time that the baby should be receiving breast milk. After 6 months, a mother could continue to use infant formula, perfectly adequate, perfectly well, not perfectly adequate. I shouldn't say that, but she could continue to use that. But the companies invented follow-on formula deliberately to try and get around the code, saying it wasn't covered by the code. And when we managed to stop them trying to do that, then they invented growing up milks, etc. So that's the sort of thing that the companies do, but the code keeps up with that through these subsequent World Health Assembly resolutions. And we know also, for example, that the companies have come up with new marketing tactics, the digital types of promotion, using social media, where we have the influencers, people that are paid in one way or another to give their opinions and sort of recommend or say how wonderful certain products are. These are things that we really, very often we are one step behind the industry when it comes to trying to clamp down on these things. But there's no doubt that the code covers those things. Digital marketing, influencers, mombassadors, if you like, this sort of term for women who are exploited really in order to sell, to promote products on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Those are all covered by the code because the code applies to all forms of promotion. So it's a matter, it's something that that we have to get to grips with. And I know that the Director General of WHO has been called on by the World Health Assembly to begin to look into this issue and how we can get to grips with it. So again, the code is incredibly important, and I think Nigel also made reference to the recent to COVID and the way the companies really exploited it in a most disgraceful way in order to try and kind of build on fears. I mean, we were all fearful during COVID, but you can imagine mothers with young babies being incredibly worried about what's going to happen in this situation, and the companies used that to kind of reinforce the fear that maybe breastfeeding, being close to your baby, wasn't the right thing to do, despite the fact that the public health recommendations coming from WHO were that mothers should continue to breastfeed their babies, that this was in the best interest of the baby. But no, that was used, and we'd seen it before. And Nigel will remember this well from his time in South Africa, that the companies did exactly the same thing during the HIV pandemic. So, you know, as we have these public health crises, etc., and of course, man-made and natural disasters, the code becomes incredibly important there, in order that we are able to protect breastfeeding and stop those sort of situations being used as a marketing opportunity for the formula companies. And just one last thing, I wanted to keep my comments just to 10 minutes so that we have ample time for questions. One of the important issues that we're facing today that again is addressed well by the code, and this is another area that has been much better articulated more recently, is the issue of conflict of interest between the formula companies and the healthcare system. I mean, when they can't get away with the blatant advertising on TV, billboards, etc., the next best way to promote their products is through the healthcare system. And how do you do that? You make nice with the healthcare system, with the doctors and the nurses, gifts, scholarships, support, etc. And that is just not on. And it's one area that the code was rather weak when it was adopted in 1981, because it did allow for companies to sponsor healthcare workers. The only condition was that the health worker had to report to the institution that they worked for that they were receiving this support. Well, clearly that is not on. It leads to the creation of a feeling of a need to reciprocate. It affects how that health worker views the company and its products, and you know the social science shows that it actually leads to a change in the prescribing or recommendation or recommending behavior of that health worker. So the resolution, the WHA resolution in 2016, with the associated guidance on ending inappropriate promotion of foods for infants and young children, really puts a stop to that and actually provides us with a list actually of the sorts of behavior that should now be viewed as a conflict of interest and should not be allowed to happen. So this is another important area where, as I say, the code has adapted to deal with it in helping protect babies and mothers. And it's our job now to make sure that this is applied, that we don't allow this type of conflict of interest to continue. Easier said than done, but I think if we put our minds to it, we can do something. So I'm going to stop there because we've got so many other interesting presentations on this panel and want to leave time for questions. But thanks for inviting me to participate.
Thank you so much, David. And I think we can take so much from what was said, what you have said, including a focus on that, what can be a massive input on the healthcare providers of what they can do. And something that you can see from that is our screening this Friday. We are showing Tigers, which shows that really, really well of how that conflict of interest can really affect the people involved. I'm going to pass on now to the wonderful Dr. Vicky Simpson, if you'd like to come on screen now too.
Hello. Hopefully you can hear me fine. I'm going to screen share. So, is that good?
Perfect. Yes, you're good.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. And thank you, David, as well, for what you just said. Hopefully what I'm going to talk about now for the next 15 minutes or so builds on what David has just said. What I'm going to focus on is why and how the code is relevant today in the UK. So Catherine already introduced me. But I just wanted to say that before working for First Steps Nutrition Trust and being focused on infant and young child feeding and nutrition in the UK, I actually worked for over 15 years internationally for different NGOs, mostly in humanitarian emergencies and fragile states. And the importance of breastfeeding in such challenging contexts is undisputed, as are the risks of formula and bottle feeding. And so the relevance of the code is a given. Working in the UK, however, I have been genuinely surprised to hear people say such things as there are no real benefits to breastfeeding in the UK, or more commonly, there are no real risks to formula feeding in the UK. We're not a poor country, we have clean water. And also, I've heard a lot, formula companies used to do bad things in poor countries, and the code isn't relevant in the UK. And so this is why I wanted to talk today about the relevance of the code in the UK. It's an international code, and as Nigel has said, that means it's not a code just for the developing world. As he also really clearly highlighted, breastfeeding benefits all babies, whether they're born in poorer or richer countries, and that means the code is relevant to us, and arguably more so than ever, given the company's ever ingenious ways of marketing, as David outlined. So this is the UK context, where we have an entrenched formula feeding culture with some of the lowest breastfeeding rates in the world. This graph uses data from the last infant feeding survey conducted in England in 2010, and it shows how formula use rapidly increases from birth. The same survey showed that most women want to breastfeed, but few meet their breastfeeding goals. So for example, among those women who stop breastfeeding after 1 or 2 weeks, 80 to 85% would have liked to have breastfed for longer. One of the key reasons we have such low breastfeeding rates in the UK is that alongside a lack of support, breastfeeding is poorly protected, hence the theme of World Breastfeeding Week this year. Existing laws reflect only some of the provisions of the code, making them significantly weaker. Of particular note, the UK law only applies to breast milk substitutes for infants under 12 months, and it permits promotion of follow-on formula. It does not prohibit promotion of breast milk substitutes in the health system, and there's very limited monitoring and very poor enforcement. The global exercise, which examined national implementation of the code in 2020, gave the UK an overall score of only 39 out of 100. The law therefore permits widespread advertising of breast milk substitutes, with the exception of infant formula. But even then, all the companies undertake what is called cross-promotion, promoting products like follow-on formula in ways which makes parents perceive they're seeing infant formula ads. And this has been backed up by research. And I'm going to come on to that a little bit more in a minute. So predatory marketing by formula companies is alive and well, and women are having their babies, unfortunately, in an environment which sets many of them up for breastfeeding failure and an end to their journeys before they wanted them to end. So I want to show you just a few examples of code violating breast milk substitute company activities in the UK in recent times. These are some of the sort of an outline of some of the provisions of the code, and I could give you examples of that match up to many of them, but the ones I've chosen to talk about today relate to advertising of the breast milk substitutes to the public, particularly through focusing on their brand and using cross-promotion, provision of subsidised formula into the health service, direct contact with mothers and mothers-to-be through baby clubs, and misleading marketing to healthcare professionals. So we're going to talk about infant formula promotion first. I've got 2 examples for you, one more generic, this one, and then one brand specific. So this here is a screenshot on the left of some advice on the benefits of bottle feeding formula found on the Tommy Tippy website a few weeks ago, which includes a sentence: baby formula will give your little one all the nutrients they need to grow and thrive without you having to go through the pain or awkwardness that breastfeeding can sometimes bring. It includes loads of inaccuracies, promotes formula feeding as essentially much easier than breastfeeding, and suggests it would allow mums to enjoy their wine and coffee, which if they were breastfeeding, they couldn't. And it was so outrageous, it hit the news. That's a screenshot of an article, which you might like to look up. And then here's my second example, which is brand or company specific. This is the UK company Kendamil, which has been using parent reviews to try to promote their first stage formula. So here are some of the quotes apparently from parents that they then repeat verbatim on their website. My son is 9 months old and has been on it since birth. After breastfeeding, I was worried about the transition to formula. I researched high and low for a formula brand that would benefit my daughter the way breast milk had. Unfortunately, complaints made against them have been upheld by the UK Advertising Standards Authority this week, so we shouldn't see any more of that. Right, moving on to my next example. This is an example of a company using partnership to promote its brand and baby club to be able to directly market to parents. So in May this year, the National Trust announced a new year-long partnership with Hip Organic, in which National Trust supporters were asked to sign up to the Hip Organic Baby Club in order to plant a tree, and also they could get a discount on any National Trust shop purchase. So basically what HIP have done is set themselves up to tap into the huge National Trust supporter base and enable them to target their marketing to young families and invariably increase their sales. Thankfully, there was a tidal wave of concerned feedback, which caused them very, very quickly to drop these features of the partnership. So that was good news. But unfortunately, because they're tied in for a year, they're still associated, HIP Organic is still associated with the National Trust. And as you can see from these screenshots, they're using their brand prominently, they're basking in the reputation of what is a great national treasure. And then on the right there, you can see from some of the formula packaging pictured how they create the opportunity for cross-promotion too. And they do this by making their follow-on and growing up milk, stage 2 and 3, so-called, look the same. And they make the brand the feature. It's the largest text, same color, same position on the packaging, and you can see it's exactly the same on their marketing of their partnership with National Trust. And then what they do is they can legally promote their stage 2 and 3 products, and basically it serves to promote infant formula too. And as I said before, this has been researched and shown to be true. There's published academic studies which show that it does work, and that's exactly why they do it. Next example is the problem of baby foods marketed for use from 4 months plus, which if used would displace breast milk in a breastfed baby. So in October 2019, First Steps Nutrition Trust published a report which looked at baby food in pouches, at the different aspects of the baby food. And one thing they did was look at which brands were marketing products from 4 months plus. And this is a table with the long list of brands. So a few have changed their age labels since then, but not many. And it's not just pouches that are a problem, it's also jars and cereals. And there's some examples I lifted from the internet very quickly last week. This example is about the issue of subsidised formula in the healthcare system, which happens in the UK. So infant feeding leads have recently told me that 2 formula companies have been attempting to get their ready-to-feed liquid products chosen by NHS procurement for use on maternity wards by offering them at prices far below normal retail values. And then I also have found out recently that the premium brand in the UK, Danone Nutritious Actimel, which is I think also the same in Republic of Ireland, has managed to get its most premium product, its most expensive product, Actimel Pro Futura, onto maternity wards. It's not, I don't think it's the liquid though, I think it's the powdered product. But what this means, it's a coup. It means they're gaining brand loyalty and probably product loyalty from the new mothers who start their babies on this formula on the hospital ward. And that's just, it's another example that has been documented in academic literature. So that's why it shouldn't be allowed. And then finally, for examples of code breaking practices, and in this instance also breaking UK laws, all companies advertise their breast milk substitutes to healthcare professionals. And the code and the UK law says that it's okay as long as the ads are scientific and factual. However, in 2016 and again in 2018, First Steps Nutrition Trust undertook a review of selected adverts which unpack the references, the academic references, and clearly demonstrate that companies are not adhering to this requirement. And earlier this year, this paper was published, which shows the same issue is ongoing. It's just constant and it's not going away. So to conclude, the few examples given show how key provisions of the code are being broken in the UK today. So on a more positive note, who are we at BFLG UK? It's the Baby Feeding Law Group UK, and what are we trying to do? So Catherine already introduced us, and just to recap, we were founded by Baby Milk Action, and we exist to challenge ongoing inappropriate marketing of breast milk substitutes, whether that contravenes UK laws or the code, and ultimately we're calling for the code in law. And while change is slow, we have had some successes and we'll keep fighting the good fight. So here are some positive examples we've seen in recent times. In 2020, the infant formula and follow-on formula regulations were updated. They're still a long way off the code, but there were some changes in there that are positive, including no longer allowing health and nutrition claims to be made on infant formula. In 2019, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health stopped taking breast milk substitute company money. And in the same year, the British Medical Journal stopped taking breast milk substitute company ads. The NHS long-term plan, which was published in 2019 and recommends and endorses the baby-friendly initiative, which requires settings to be code compliant. And then in May this year, Alison Fulis, MP and chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Infant Feeding and Inequalities, tabled an early day motion calling for the code in law. So this currently, or the last time I looked, it had 25 signatories, and the greater the support, the more likely the motion will be brought in front of Parliament. And all of this comes to the backdrop of the new opportunity we have now, post-Brexit, to strengthen UK regulations independently of what the EU does. Whoops. So what can you do to support the code, protect breastfeeding and all babies, however they are fed? Here are my suggestions. If you want to see the code in law, please do urge your MP to support Alison Fulis's early day motion. If you want to follow and support their work, you can attend the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Infant Feeding and Inequalities. You can report any violations of UK law to Ofcom if it relates to TV shows, to the Advertising Standards Authority, which covers TV, radio, print media, outdoor advertising, online advertising and more. Or you can also report to trading standards if it's in relation to retail activity. That's a little bit complicated. There's more guidance on that on the BFLG UK website, and do email me if you'd like more information. You can report any violations of the code to Baby Milk Action, and in Northern Ireland you can also do that to Code Monitoring Northern Ireland, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. And for companies, governments and NGOs, etc., we would urge you to avoid any partnerships with breast milk substitute companies. For healthcare professionals, we'd suggest you avoid speaking at breast milk substitute industry sponsored events or taking breast milk substitute company money to run training or give talks. And it's important to remember that this is not allowed if you're working in a baby-friendly initiative accredited setting. And then lastly, for families and healthcare professionals, we'd suggest you avoid breast milk substitute company care lines, baby clubs and websites. And if you would like conflict of interest free information and advice on infant feeding, you can go to the NHS website, HSE, I guess, in Republic of Ireland. And also please do look at the First Steps Nutrition Trust website, where we have lots of information designed for use by healthcare professionals. Thank you. Please do follow us on Twitter if you're interested. Take a look at our website, and if you'd like to be in touch, there's my email address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for that truly, truly important information. I am going to pass over now to Claire Alcott to share her experiences and her information as well.
Yeah, hopefully the share screen is it working for us?
Not yet, no.
Oh. Well, while we're trying to do that, I'm really sorry, folks. Maybe as a former antenatal teacher, I suggest everybody has a quick stretch. I don't know why it's not sharing that. Yeah,
there we go. Yeah, that's us.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody, particularly Catherine and to Jennifer for hosting, and everybody on the Breast Double team. Thanks obviously to Nigel and Claire, the other Claire Patton, and to David and to Vicky for your great presentations, which has obviously set the scene on the code. And I've been given the brief to bring everybody up to date with what's happening in the South, or the Republic of Ireland. I'm going to be outlining the very briefest of history, provide some context of what's happening in the Republic few examples of violations, but mainly good news from Ireland, and just finish with how you contact us. Been very keen all along to be aware of the shared responsibility message from World Breastfeeding Week and how many agencies are actually involved in the protection of breastfeeding in order to realise the rights of women and children, and now dyadic rights. We all love that idea. And again, I'm having issues here. I'm really sorry. The briefest of history. Around 10 years ago, a group of us who'd been making the odd complaint to the Food Safety Authority of Ireland were invited to a meeting. And subsequent to that, we tried to work out whether or not Ireland should have an IBFAN group. There were limitations on those of us who were existing councillors with voluntary organisations and couldn't take any political action at all. So I invited Patty and Mike over from Baby Milk Action to a meeting at my house, and we decided we'd set up a workshop, which the images on the top right, I'm sat with Patty at the front there, and we had a significant workshop at the Rotunda Hospital with a large number of attendees, the aim of which was to scope interest in having an IBFAN group in the Republic of Ireland. Key speakers from law, from the Food Safety Authority, Genevieve Becker, and other people from Baby Milk Action. From that, we decided we would proceed, and we set up a group by 8 years ago, spent quite a lot of time formalising to become an actual organisation and all the information that required. Spent also quite a bit of time making submissions to things like the Advertising Standards Authority of Ireland and the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, and to the Department of Food and Agriculture. And then moving forward significantly, at the end of 2009, we had a showing of tigers, and showing that we were trying to bring in different agencies at this point. We have the National Breastfeeding Coordinator there, obviously Patty, and representing the protagonist himself, Saeed, media, the wonderful Sabina Higgins, who we know helped to launch Breast of All, medicine, and academia. And that was quite seminal in actually forming liaisons and relationships with a number of different agencies. And from that point, we then have done a number of campaigns. This one, particularly from National Breastfeeding last year, which was October, was a copies of Gabrielle Palmer's book on the politics of breastfeeding to some key policy makers around Ireland. So that's a tweet showing that it was going to Minister Stephen Donnelly, who was a newly appointed Minister of Health. And then the lower pictures are key member Malvina and baby Moya meeting Roisin Shorthall, one of our members of Parliament, and Liz and her daughter Anya meeting the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. So that was less than a year ago. And from that time, we have done a number of campaigns, but it is important to understand the context of what's going on in the Republic of Ireland, where we have one of the lowest known breastfeeding rates in the world, got really low in the 60s. There's a snapshot study that was done in the 80s, still showing inconsistent data and rates under 30% in some hospital units. And then a study I did in the year 2000 based on 1999, which again had, although that was national figure rates rather than just a snapshot in 1 week, was again showing hospitals that weren't consistently keeping records. However, since in the 20 years since then, we have shown overall rising figures for initiation. There are still issues that we need to address for sure, and some inconsistencies, but at the Irish Maternity Indicator System, it showed a 63.8% initiation rate. That report was last year, and the big drop-off seemed to be before discharge from hospital. But overall, the picture is significantly better than it was a few years ago, in which case I also want to say the other major context in Ireland is, of course, that we are a key manufacturer, home user because of the low rates of breastfeeding, and exporter of breastfeeding, of infant formula. We appreciate that the code covers obviously weaning foods too, and formula and milk products for children of a higher age than first formula, and also bottles and teats. But is certainly a complicated relationship in the context of Ireland's big employers of the pharmaceutical industry and indeed dairy, known here as Big Pharma and Big Pharma. And that is really significant. And I would put to you, it's well worth reading a very recent article from Ali O'Byrne about Ireland's complicated relationship with infant formula. It's followed a number of articles, such as the one on the top right about the outrageous targeting, but also to have in context, just when Baby Feeding Milk Group was starting, we had this massive launch, and that's from a government minister trying particularly to send exports of milk to China. And since the change in milk quotas, our incidence of formula manufacturing has increased considerably. The other context for Ireland is the report that that was highlighted by Vicky. Ireland also scores 39 out of 100, and that's mainly because of course, it is led by Europe, so most countries in Europe. So here's a few examples of marketing that's reached parents literally in the last few weeks. We have the Tesco baby event, which had not just one, but two code violating companies of Aptamil and the bottle company MAM. And if you attended this webinar, you were entitled, only a couple of weeks ago this is, to go and collect a baby box at the end of it, which had samples in it. And then we also have the example that, again, that Vicky's used about baby clubs, the Baby Doc Club, with the emphasis in doc, does almost a daily promotion of SMA follow-on formula, and now has this recommended by 99% of their viewers. But since it is a web page virtually run by Nestle SMA, then that's most of their readership are going to be commenting on that. And only on August the 4th, which is all of 24 hours ago, Kenda Milk has arrived in Ireland, and we already having the promotions come into Dunnes Stores and Boots, a situation that we think we can report to the Advertising Standards Authority of Ireland. So initial comment has gone to the Food Safety Authority of Ireland from Baby Feeding Law Group, but we may have, we hope, the same ruling that they've just had in the UK. And finally, not to miss out our other key player here, I was just searching for a ferry journey to go and visit my family in England, and I get the pop-up ad for Cow and Gate follow-up milk. The point being that they're continually circumventing the code by the allowance in Ireland for them to actually advertise follow-on and growing up milk. First milk advertising isn't allowed, that's under Irish legislation, and we can do something about that. But of course, we still want to know about these violations at Baby Feeding Law Group, so we have an idea of what's actually happening out there. The marketing to professional examples are the Irish Food Allergy Network. As you know, there's been a lot more promotion of specialist formulae to health professionals. And whilst, of course, they need scientific and factual information, should education be done by industry, or should it be coming from independent sources such as First Steps Nutrition Trust, who have been wonderful in supporting Baby Feeding Law Group with information? Then there was an SMA live webinar as recently as May, which lots of healthcare professionals, I understand, went to. And of course, not just is it allergy milks, but the promotions are often to do with crying babies, sleep problems, colicky babies, in order to gain this new market for mums who have a baby with a problem and will transfer from maybe starting to breastfeed. And the holy grail, of course, for the manufacturers is to get the first-time mum, and then they'll often use the same product for subsequent babies. However, the third example in the middle was actually a study day which was being run by a maternity hospital, and we no longer get that. We caused quite a lot of fuss about that particular event, and we no longer get maternity hospitals co-hosting with the formula companies. Things have changed, of course, during COVID because nearly everything is online, but they were examples of how they market to the professionals. However, now the positive news. The campaigns that we've been running, we were very lucky in May of this year to have as partner UNICEF Ireland, and we're very grateful to them, and they helped us greatly with graphics. Example on the left of where we tweeted as Baby Feeding All Group Ireland, and on the right there would have been a corresponding each day where UNICEF Ireland actually put that out. So that was May to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the code. Others, and we've had significant good news in that the Health Service Executive has extended the right to lactation breaks until the child reaches 2 years in recent times. And our Minister for Children has made a proposal to extend breastfeeding breaks for all mothers returning to work, thanks in some significant part to one of our own members, Dr. Liz O'Sullivan, having communications with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and arguing the case. Also, in terms of code and legislation, there was a motion proposed at the Irish College of General Practitioners AGM in May, again corresponding with the 40th anniversary of the code, and the motion was passed. And we now have resources being developed for general practitioners specifically on breastfeeding, and of code importance, a removal of advertising of all formula products in the ICGP's own monthly journal, which is called Forum. Other related things, thanks to considerable hard work from a great number of people we don't have time to thank individually, but we have had a brand new position paper from the College of Physicians launched in the last few weeks. The key there is they cover the faculty of pediatrics, public health, and obstetrics and gynecology, all highly relevant to the professionals working with the mother and baby dyad. And we then also in May had an announcement from the Minister for Health, who we'd sent the politics of breastfeeding to, on a significant amount of money being released to increase the number of lactation consultants in maternity hospitals, which many organisations have been fighting for a long time. Then some of our other communications in order to try and have a shared responsibility towards protecting breastfeeding was collaboration with policymakers. And we've named again, for example, Roisin Shorthill here, looking to find out how much it would cost to implement the full National Breastfeeding Action Plan, which mentions implementation of the WHO code, the BMS code, and subsequent WHA resolutions. And there have been other policymakers with whom we've been doing quite a lot of liaison in the last few weeks. Our current campaign for World Breastfeeding Week is with the National Women's Council of Ireland, and another very significant national organisation. We have this week, we have a call to action to the government. Of course, there were very many points, but the three main points is adequate funding of the Breastfeeding Action Plan, which is due for renewal, and fully legislating the Code of Marketing, and the legislation should be extended in terms of breastfeeding workplace breaks in order to protect all mothers better. We've obviously here been invited to Breastable, we've been working alongside other IBFAN groups on another matter which Maria will outline for Code Monitor Northern Ireland, and also, of course, with the media. So here we are. In order to contact Baby Feeding Law Group Ireland, we're on the usual social media platforms, but it's most frequently done by email to bflgireland@gmail.com. You might want to contact us with code violations or queries if you're not sure which agency is responsible for the issue that you saw, if you'd like to join us, or for news of future campaigns. So I'd like to thank everybody concerned with the protection of breastfeeding. It's multi-agency, not just health, Department of Education, Department of Trade, Department of Employment, Department of Industry. Everybody needs to be concerned. The code is as relevant today as it was 40 years ago, as David's pointed out, and it's really time to legislate on the island of Ireland, both in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, remembering that protection is very much a shared responsibility. We need to work together and not against each other. It's been wonderful working with the other IBFAN groups, and as stated by Sabina Higgins during her launch at Breastable, a multifaceted approach is needed. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was wonderful, and I know that there will be many people taking up that call to action to speak with other people and grow as a powerful group to make change. Thank you so much. I'd like to call on Maria Heron now to speak, and looking forward to hearing from her.
Hi there, everybody. And Catherine, I'll just check in with you first of all as to what you can actually see on the screen. Hopefully it's just the slide, or is it the whole presentation with notes?
We can see the slide, just thank you.
Oh, fabulous. Okay. Great when it works. So thank you so much to Breastable for this opportunity to share some perspectives on the code from Northern Ireland, really, I suppose, from the perspective of the advocacy group Code Monitoring Northern Ireland. Code Monitoring Northern Ireland was set up nearly 6 years ago by local mum Claire Hackett as a private closed group on Facebook, really set up to discuss the code, to learn more about what constituted violations and how to report them. The group itself now has over 200 members on Facebook, which includes parents and health practitioners, and has over 400 followers on Twitter. And the focus has evolved quite significantly from those early days of really trying to find out about the code to now specifically looking for full implementation of the code in Northern Ireland. So looking back over the posts on Facebook, it's clear that many people were motivated to join Code Monitoring Northern Ireland to share the blatant marketing of breast milk substitutes that they could see mainly in shops, but also in the online environment. It's been quite a learning curve for everyone trying to figure out if the products marketed on the supermarket shelves constituted a breach of local regulations as well as a code violation. Most of us have also experienced the ads that pop up online promoting bottles, teats and formula products with claims of being most like breastfeeding or closer to breast milk, and lots of promises of convenience. Discounted first milks still appear in our shops on a regular basis. Initially, we gave benefit of the doubt. Perhaps it was just a new member of staff who was not aware of the local legislation which prohibits such actions. But then when this behaviour is repeated over and over again by the same shops, we began to realise that these companies do not appear to be concerned about the code or about the local legislation. There have also been very heartfelt discussions about the apparent goodwill appeals for infant formula for food banks, particularly during the recent pandemic, and whether these constitute a breach and who to report them to. We've been navigating this minefield with the help of people such as Paddy Rundle from Baby Milk Action, Claire Alcott from Baby Feeding Law Group Ireland, Helen Crawley from First Steps Nutrition, and more recently from Vicky Simpson from Baby Feeding Law Group UK. And we've also liaised with Janet Calvert from the Public Health Agency over the years on many matters of concern within health services, including the proposed baby fairs, which were sponsored by non-code compliant breast milk substitute companies. I'm delighted to say, in that particular case, because of the stance taken by the Public Health Agency, these baby fairs have not been happening in Northern Ireland in recent years, in contrast to the Republic of Ireland, where they had gone ahead until recently and literally only stopped because of COVID. Members of Code Monitoring Northern Ireland and the public are encouraged to report breaches of the code to Baby Milk Action. If there's an issue, if the issue is also breach of local regulations, we encourage people to contact the environmental health officers in their local council who have responsibility for monitoring and enforcement. However, this process isn't clear-cut, and as far as we're aware, there's no centralised record of breaches, and there doesn't appear to be any prosecutions of those who breach local regulations. However, our most recent correspondence with the councils indicates that all of the councils are now aware of their remit, and it's good to see, and we would be very happy to work with the councils on this issue in the future. Besides the incessant marketing of breast milk substitutes in retail outlets, television, radio, magazines, and social media, we're also concerned about the growing influence that the big formula companies in particular are having with their involvement in public bodies in Northern Ireland. For instance, Safe Food, which is an all-Ireland body set up to ensure food safety and to provide advice on nutrition and healthy eating, has recently appointed a representative from Danone to the Safe Food Advisory Committee. Danone, as most people would know, are a food business, but they're also the world's largest dairy company and the second largest producer of breast milk substitutes, including infant formulas, follow-on formulas, and formulas marketed as growing up milks. Danone dominates the formula market in Ireland with its Cow and Gate and Optimal brands. Code Monitoring Northern Ireland, along with Baby Feeding Law Group Ireland, Baby Feeding Law Group UK, and the GP Infant Feeding Network, have recently written to Health Minister Stephen Donnelly in the Republic of Ireland and Robin Swan in Northern Ireland to outline our specific concerns about this appointment, which we consider to be a clear conflict of interest. And we believe that breast milk substitute manufacturers and their representatives, whether in a professional or personal capacity, as attested by Danone, have no place in shaping policy or advising nutrition for infants within the government or any advisory body. Code Monitoring Northern Ireland are calling for full implementation of the code. The code outlines that governments are responsible for ensuring that families receive unbiased infant feeding information. And while we're aware that parents receive information from the health services, we also have evidence of parents being bombarded with advertising, including this targeted online marketing, which seeks to persuade parents to use formula instead of breastfeeding. The code stipulates that breast milk substitute companies have a responsibility to be fully code compliant, even in the countries which have not fully implemented the code. It is clear from the data which we have been compiling that there are ongoing breaches of the code and local regulations in Northern Ireland by the breast milk substitute industry. Is it possible that the incessant and aggressive marketing of breast milk substitutes is contributing to our ongoing low rates of breastfeeding in Northern Ireland, which along with the Republic of Ireland are the lowest in the world? The recent Northern Ireland Life and Time survey found that while the majority of people in Northern Ireland are supportive of breastfeeding, there has been a downward trend in attitudes about breastfeeding in public. Furthermore, half of the respondents felt that in the long term, it didn't matter whether baby was breastfed or formula fed, and most respondents were actually unaware of the benefits of breastfeeding. At Code Monitoring Northern Ireland, we believe that if there was full implementation of the code in Northern Ireland, this would help ensure that parents could make use of unbiased information to make their infant feeding decisions, rather than being influenced by marketing. There would be no promotion or idealizing of breast milk substitutes. Information about breast milk substitutes would be factual and scientific, and health professionals would not receive their main education on infant feeding from breast milk substitute companies. There would also be clarity that all formula products contain the same approved and regulated ingredients, and that there would be no difference between the brands. In recent years, our politicians in Northern Ireland have become more interested and vocal about infant feeding issues, and Breastable have been a great platform for public discussion on breastfeeding and the aggressive marketing which undermines breastfeeding. Code Monitoring Northern Ireland would like to use this opportunity to appeal to our Minister for Health and our policy and decision makers to dramatically improve the health of babies and mothers, society and the environment by fully incorporating the code and subsequent resolutions into domestic law. This would be a political act that would leave a positive, lasting legacy for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that. And we will ensure to pass on your message to the Minister to call for the full implementation of the code in every way that we can as well. I'm very aware of the time that we have now, so I will be calling for a couple of people to come in and ask their questions. I know that Malvina Walsh, if you are here on the call, I'd like to welcome you to ask a question.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yes.
Great, thanks a million. So I'll go straight to the questions. We're seeing great activity both north and south of the border here in Ireland. And David, I wanted to thank you for your language back in May when you spoke about the need for identifying political champions and, you know, to use Daddy is our political champion, and to use that language as well as we go forward to kind of bring politicians on board. So it's okay for us to ask for the legislation, but perhaps, you know, to speed things up, we could get some support from what has been done in other countries to actually introduce bills into the government to bring about that legislation. So I am just wondering if David or perhaps Nigel, in your international experiences, are there people that you can bring in, you know, to have us ready? Because I think the political awareness is growing. Paula Bradley said it on the session in the politics of breastfeeding in Northern Ireland, that she felt it was time for an all-party group in Northern Ireland. Yesterday on Twitter, Senator Pippa Hackett in the South, Minister of State for Biodiversity, has said that she has always supported breastfeeding and fully commits to working towards the implementation of the code. So we need to be ready, you know, when the time comes. Elections will be coming around. So how can you help us with that? That's the first part of the question. Second part of the question, sorry about baby, is also about help. And to use a marketing term, disruption. So in marketing, they talk about disruptive marketing strategies, you know, to capture a market. So, you know, here it's been mentioned today, Claire Alcott mentioned it a lot, that there is a huge presence of big food and big pharma. And there are some countries in the world that are much softer entry points for big food, you know, with the promise of jobs and kind of sustained market expansion. And Nigel, you talked about livelihoods, so it's very attractive to our governments. But my question is, could you help those of us in countries, okay, those of us on this island, the likes of New Zealand, where we see very tiny islands? For example, here in Ireland, they have said we supply 12% of the world's formula and we want 20. So how, I think there's some key possibly strategically going forward. So yeah, that's me trying to ask for more help from WHO and UNICEF. So yeah, in summary, my questions are, you know, are there resources, are there legal expertise to help us drive this forward? Because many of us in advocacy come from mothers groups, from healthcare professionals, and not necessarily trade professionals. And now we're seeing some politicians in the group as well. But we must compete for time. We're up against the biggest lobby in the south is IBEC, who are an enterprise, represent big business. A couple of weeks ago, they came out publicly that they lobbied the Taoiseach here in our government to not allow an extension of lactation breaks in the workplace and so on. And so, yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
Malvina, it's great to see you there. First of all, I'd be very happy to see that. I hadn't heard about IBEC or IBEC and that lobbying, and I'd be grateful if you could share any information about that. The very rapid answer, just in the closing minutes, is yes. I think WHO and UNICEF will be very ready to get on board. I think we are looking at a sort of a timing and an opportunity. In part, I think we've got to be, one of the things that the research has shown is that we need to be a lot smarter. We don't have the same sort of resources. Industry is putting in, you know, anywhere between $3 and $5 billion a year on marketing. We don't have that money available. But what we have is that we do have networks, and we have, society, I think, on our hands, you know, in our available. So what I would say, the answer is yes. I think there are a couple of other quite strategic countries that even if we don't do things globally, the question is how can we create a sort of a supply and demand model where there is visible and audible demand from civil society for change, and that those who are in the decision-making corridors of government, that there is a clear pathway in terms of what should be done. And we need to make it so compelling that, in fact, there is no reason for them not to do it. In fact, that it is politically inopportune for them to do it, that the credibility and the reputational liability for not doing something is so high that they need to act. But what I don't think we have done is been as strategic as we need to be. We need to join up not just our good sentiment and our goodwill but we need to be much more strategic in terms of those political processes, so that as things come together from a point of view of social outrage. And I really think that we just simply need to be making and just going with the message, this marketing is unacceptable. There are no aspects of marketing of BMS that are ever acceptable. We should be simply saying, yes, this area is off limits. It's irrespective of, dairy. We're not saying taking the product off the shelf, but the distorting and the disruptive and the exploitive marketing is simply unacceptable. Then the politicians need to do their bit, and they need to be supported in terms of those legal pathways to achieve that. So in short, the answer is yes, we would be very willing to engage on this, but I think it is a process where we can't just have it a matter of goodwill and keen individuals or even groups. We need to have political allies to say, how do we make it possible within government, and what is the type of societal reaction that makes it possible for the politicians to do their job? Over.
Yeah, and if I could just add to what Nigel has said, I think if you do have some political allies, I think it's a good idea to get them to help in informing and influencing other politicians within Parliament. For example, the Interparliamentary Union with UNICEF, WHO, and some others, we did a series of regional workshops to try and raise awareness amongst parliamentarians of the importance of nutrition, of the importance of breastfeeding. Many just don't know it, they don't get it. And I think we can make a very convincing case and get them interested and get them to realize that this is actually part of their responsibility to their constituents in protecting the health of mothers and babies. I mean, we've found, I would say the experience shows that they are interested once they know what we're talking about. And an example of a country that adopted a strategy that was very successful in terms of getting legislation on the code and maternity protection passed very quickly was in Vietnam, where they deliberately targeted the members of the National Assembly, and through a series of workshops, providing the information, providing evidence of the violations that were going on, about how the companies were manipulating and exploiting mothers in Vietnam. It led to the very early and almost unanimous adoption of that legislation, because the politicians, the parliamentarians, all understood what this was about and what was at stake. So I think that's an important part of it. And we have, as Nigel says, we have this experience. We have we can help. I can't say we anymore because I don't work for UNICEF anymore. But you know, we do know how to build that capacity and knowledge and advocacy. So yes, certainly, I think I certainly would be more than happy to share with you some ideas about that. But yeah, I think that's a good way to move ahead.
Thank you so much. We are coming up to the end of the session now, and I want to thank all of our speakers for their input. I'm going to invite everybody on the panel to give us perhaps one line of where you think we need to be going to together to truly implement the WHO or the WHA code here in Northern Ireland in particular. And I'd also encourage everybody in the chat to share what their terminal or what they think of when they hear the terminology, the code on our Mentimeter. The link is in the chat as well. So if we can start with Claire, Alcott, if you could begin and give us your one line of where we need to be going in Northern Ireland to implement the code.
To work together, many agencies, and listen to Maria and Code Monitoring Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Claire. We'll move on directly on to Maria then from there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's just been a fantastic session, really inspirational, and fantastic to hear that World Health Organization and UNICEF would be willing to support us. And we obviously would be very keen to work together for the aim of full implementation of the code. How wonderful would that be for the island of Ireland? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. We'll move to David, please.
I think I'm going to finish with the with that expression. If you see something, say something. Everybody out there, I think Claire and others gave information as to where you can report violations. So do it. If you see something, let's not let them get away with it. That would just be one thing that we can do.
Thank you, David. And Vicky, if you'd like to come in.
Hi, two suggestions. One is to engage with the all-party parliamentary group on infant feeding and inequalities and support the early day motion. But another suggestion and reflection when we're talking about the code and advocating for the code is to just strip it back to what it really is. It's about inappropriate marketing, which poses risks to babies and mothers.
Thank you, Vicky. And I see that Alison Thulis has joined us in the session as well. And just thank you for the mention of the APPG AFA. Move over to Claire Patton, please.
Thank you. I would say, first of all, that we are never going to get kind of full implementation and adherence to the WHO code until we also sort of get to grips with battling the misinformation and disinformation, et cetera, that's online, because the BMS industry is upping their game all of the time, and they would well be able to stay within the letter of the WHO code, if not the spirit, even if they were to get rid of their traditional media advertising, because there are so many other outs that they can take advantage of now. So that would be my general finishing point. And then my more specific point that would be to Northern Ireland. I think that, and this is more kind of just generally about politics in Northern Ireland, I think that all of us who have any kind of voice on the island in Northern Ireland, down south, is to try to make sure that our politicians, especially in the north, are focusing on the issues like this that is really, really important to us, and not getting sidetracked by the more kind of embedded cultural issues that seems to take up an awful lot of time up here. So I would be advising us all to be thinking about what is important to us and how can we lobby our politicians to get them to listen to what's really important to us, in this instance, protecting maternal and child health through the WHO code. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. And finally, I'll come to you, Nigel, if you can finish with a...
Yeah, well, again, just in case I don't say it, many, many thanks to everybody. I would say we need to be more strategic. I think we need to be better coordinated. I think we need to remain resilient, and don't underestimate or don't believe that we can't change things. I think that it is a daunting task, but I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility for society to call for change. And I think the advantage of Ireland is that it is so visible in many ways globally, that to achieve something there would be, I think, really a leader and catalytic elsewhere.
Incredible. Thank you so much. As you can see here, we have our word cloud, and please do continue to add it, and we'll be adding it to our resource folder at the end of this session. Just some words that we think of when we think of the terminology, the fact that we haven't heard of it before, protection, guidelines within quotation marks, I think is a very strong one. And I think this is an incredible thing that we can continue to build on, and hopefully we can change our thinking points on what the code truly is. Just a reminder that on tomorrow night we will be screening the film Tigers, which is a very powerful film on the breast milk substitute companies in Pakistan, and a story that keeps repeating, that a very strong line from the film. We will have a panel beforehand that includes Amir, who was the man that the film is based on. We have Andy Peterson, who is the writer and producer of the film. We have Tracy Wagner-Razi, who was Maggie, was partially based on one of the characters from the film. And we have Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, TV presenter and fantastic doctor, and very much an advocate for breastfeeding in the public, joining us for a panel which will be headed up by Karen Hall. And we really do hope that you will join us for that session. And we will speak with you all very, very soon. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again to our fantastic speakers.